And I'll hand over to Gina. Over to you.
Thank you, Deborah. Right, let me see if I can share my screen. Okay, we can all see, I think. Let's put this a bit bigger and get rid of the sides. Okay, so thank you so much to Deborah and to Genevieve, who unfortunately is not very well, for inviting me here today. It's really is a privilege for me to be able to talk to such an interesting network of people with such a wealth of knowledge. And I apologize so much for the technical issues. My laptop just crashed just as we were coming in. But we're here, we're ready. I'm Gina, and to give you a very brief insight into my background, because Deborah has done a fantastic job, I trained as an environmental scientist in Scotland, and I've worked formerly as a science communicator, covering topics from forests to black holes and everything in between. My two greatest passions have always been the natural world and stories. The stories that we as humans share to help us shape and understand our own interaction with the natural world. And increasingly, I've become interested in how we've constructed the story of what nature is. So this morning, I just want you to sit back and relax. This is not going to be a taxing journey, just one where we can explore this concept a little bit and decide collectively whether it matters. But before we dive in, I just want you to take a moment to think about, what have you done this morning? If you want to, you can share this in the chat. There's no obligation to. But what activities have you engaged with? Maybe there was some singing in the shower. Maybe this image resembles your morning quite well. News on the telephone, opening up the laptop, coffee on the side. Maybe if you're one of the lucky few, you stepped outside for a moment, went for a jog. Did your bare feet touch the earth? Has anybody had breakfast outside? Made a fire to heat the coffee on? Where does your coffee come from? How many birds have you listened to this morning? Are they different from the ones that you heard yesterday? How many species of trees are outside your window? Has a plant come into flower? Without looking outside, is it cloudy or clear today? We are living in a time of disconnect. In the past 200 years as a global society, we've gone on this mass acceleration of growth. And while we are reaping the benefits, we've positioned ourselves as managers or stakeholders or visitors to the natural world. In terms of experience, we're largely removed from nature. A few years ago, my partner and I came to this somewhat painful realization. Despite both being passionate about the natural world, despite having studied in environmental sciences, despite advocating for protection, preservation, and promotion of nature, this is how we were living, in a nature-culture dichotomy. Our physical experience of the natural world was noticeably separate from daily life. So we began to ask if we could change that. We looked at how much time we spent outside, and it was depressingly little. So we set ourselves a very simple challenge: to spend 50% of our time outside for a year. There were a few other rules. This had to be done in combination with work and personal life. There was no running away to the woods for a year. The 50% had to be applied each season. So we couldn't spend all summer outside and all winter inside. And we had to sleep every night outside. And we did this for a year. And it was a success in many ways. That immersive interaction with the natural world gave it such prominent value in our daily life. And equally, it helped us to find our place in nature. And it shaped our approach to our work that we've been doing since. Now, for me, there are two things that really stood out during the year. One was how we perceived our shared experience in very, very different ways, and two, the importance of wildness in everyday life. And I'd like to spend a little bit of time expanding on both of these points. The idea of wildness we're going to return to later, but firstly, I'd like to look at the idea of perception. I'm sure it will be obvious to all of you that there are clear physical differences between my partner and I. My partner, if you were to give him a label, would probably be your stereotypical outdoorsman. He is a survivor, he is white, he is male, he has a beard, and he is a key target market for adventure retailers. Equipment largely caters for his body type and also how his body reacts to changes in the environment. I am a female, I'm a type 1 diabetic, I'm slightly above average height by UK standards, and I am always cold. And maybe this is something you recognize from your own experiences when camping or walking outdoors. But why is that? I mean, it can't just be because my trousers are always too short. Am I not fit enough? Do I not move around enough when we're outside? Well, no, biologically, it's because I am colder, or rather, I feel colder. On average, when in the same environment, while our core temperatures stay the same, women's extremities, hands, feet, knees can be up to 3 degrees colder. So we're feeling colder. Now, for an evolutionary perspective, that's been important when caring for offspring, for example, to notice changes in the environment more rapidly. Yet this rhetoric has been lost if we look at outdoor engagements, the concept of dominance and of survival. Who we expect to see engaging in outdoor environments and activities can be somewhat narrow. And I've spent years helping on courses that teach skills to engage with nature, and the audience is largely male. My wife is not outdoorsy is a typical comment, but this never made sense to me. Unless there is some secret lineage of indoor women, both sexes evolved in the wild. Yet we are increasingly defining what qualities a person should have to enjoy the outdoors. And this is not just from a gender perspective. This is Christian Cooper. You may have read about him a couple of years ago. He's an avid birder and he sits on the New York City Audubon Society. He was involved in an incident in 2020. An altercation occurred when he was walking in a park and he asked a woman to put a dog on her lead. She rang the police and claimed she was being assaulted by him. Christian recorded the encounter and it makes difficult viewing, but there's a lot at play here. Safety is genuinely a huge issue for women in nature. And it's one of the arguments I come across frequently when it comes to engagement. Going out in nature alone as a woman is scary, but ironically, it's usually the threat of our own species that's the problem. Regardless of this, Christian's experience opened up a discussion on who we expect to be engaging in recognized nature activities. So the more I started to look at and notice these differences, it stimulated me to look at the nature-culture dichotomy and question what it is doing to our perception of and our engagement with the natural world. And I started with a really, really simple question. What is nature? If I say the word nature, what comes into your head? Maybe it's something like this. Maybe the species or the landscape is slightly different, but for me, this would be a fairly good visualization of what nature is. If we adopt a dictionary definition, this is what nature is. Essentially, it is something that is separate from people. But this is a very narrow definition. It doesn't chime with how many people across the world experience their relationship with nature. Here you can see Decame and Cuvette summarize that the meaning of nature appears rare and recent and contradictory with most other visions of nature, including former European representations and contemporary foreign ones. This is something that I could certainly recognize if I think about how my perception of nature has changed from childhood, for instance. How a scientific framing has impacted my own relationship rather than deepening it, it has possibly introduced a divide, which is slightly ironic for an environmentalist. But who decided this? Who decided what nature is? I'm sure you can probably guess the culprits in our story. I'm afraid we have to look to a few white Western adult male individuals, the founding fathers of conservation. The texts of Thoreau, Muir, and Leopold, while beautiful, have presented a slightly narrow perspective on nature. The words that inspired the national parks movement in the US to protect and preserve, a globally recognized vision of what nature is. But the national park designations in the US were far from an inclusive model when it came to accessibility, forcibly removing and then excluding communities and races to create essentially recreational parks. They were even shaky when it comes to species protection, and the process has inadvertently shaped what nature is determined to be from both a policy angle and from our own perception and experience. Now, Jedediah Purdy, writing in the New Yorker on environmentalism's history, said that for Grant, Roosevelt, and other architects of the country's parks and game refuges, wild nature was worth saving for its aristocratic qualities. Where these were lacking, they were indifferent. At the end of the article, Purdy concludes, however, that ironically enough, Madison Grant, writing about extinction, was right. The natural world that future generations live in will be the one we create for them. In which case, surely it is really important to have as many voices at the environmental table as possible. Because from a climate perspective, there's a shifting focus from preservation to one of restoration. We're now in year 2 of the UN Decade of Restoration. Restoration sits within the Sustainable Development Goal 13 on climate action. And in fact, ecosystem restoration appears as one of the top 5 mitigation options in the recent IPCC report. So can we restore? Can we create nature? And does it bring any other benefits than climate mitigation? Some of you may have heard about a very famous ecological experiment here in the Netherlands, the Oswald Plosser. This began in the 1980s as an ecological experiment in rewilding. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it now, but the reason I highlight it is because it began as an ecological experiment, but it has morphed into a social one, as people's understanding of nature and how it operates is continually challenged. Every year it stimulates debate and discussion, and our idea of wilderness is forced to flex. So wilderness, this idea of a natural environment that is largely untouched by humans. It's very similar to the dictionary definition of nature. And it also often comes together with the idea of rewilding, where humans adopt a largely hands-off approach to ecological restoration. Rewilding is becoming increasingly interesting from the perspective of climate resilience. But despite this positive rhetoric of restoration, there is a slight danger that ecological rewilding perpetuates this idea of a nature-culture dichotomy. In embodying this, we address a symptom of the climate crisis, environmental destruction, without getting to the cause, environmental disconnect. For ecological rewilding to truly thrive, it needs to go hand in hand with human rewilding. And for that, we need to shift our nature-culture dichotomy lens and think about wildness, how we as humans experience nature. What happens if we are able to find a little wildness, if we rewild humans and give nature a role in everyday life again? Well, firstly, we see quite a dramatic perception shift. we can expand our own definition of what nature is, so that we begin to see it in our locality, to engage with it, not search for it out there elsewhere. Natural elements gain prominence and value, and we move from a position of separation to cohabitation. And from there, we can begin to really see potential. We know from research that introducing natural elements in an urban setting, for example, has positive impacts on social cohesion, on health, on education. When people are able to connect and interact with those elements, the effect is even stronger. These are positive impacts that form some of the fundamental building blocks of society, of culture. Just by twisting that focus to include nature within our model of culture, rather than having the two separate. And we've seen this ourselves in real terms. We've delivered higher education courses outdoors. There are more than enough windowless lecture halls filled with students learning about the state of our planet. But for students, a physical connection with the natural world causes fundamental shifts in their understanding of nature, but also their place in nature. For a generation that is growing up with the weight of the world on its shoulders and a desperation to do something to change the current environmental trajectory, it's incredibly grounding. As one student summarized last year, I feel more alive. The weight of the issues we and they are up against is really a problem. During my PhD, I had 4 supervisors. 3 of them experienced burnouts. I've sat in discussion groups with people writing the IPCC reports and watched them break down in tears, overwhelmed by the challenges ahead. This is not a situation to ignore. Ecological change cannot happen if those advocating for it are burnt out or disheartened into inaction. And for women in particular, we know that health and education of girls goes hand in hand with climate resilience, from examples in projects such as Project Drawdown. But this is predominantly viewed for a developing sector. And what is perhaps being overlooked is the nature-culture dichotomy in developed nations. We know eco-anxiety, for example, is rising. We know girls are experiencing greater mental health challenges. At a bachelor's level, the number of women studying in environmental sciences typically equals the number of men. We know that the demand for nature connection activities is on the rise. But we also know that outdoor activities and spaces typically favor male audiences. So what I'm really passionate about doing is getting to these fundamental issues and turning them into action. This is not about going back to nature, but recognizing the world that most of us occupy is not the one that we have evolved to live in. We need to give nature a role in everyday modern life to generate a rooted ripple effect that stimulates people to connect with nature on their own terms, that impacts the products we consume and the decisions that we make. At Green Roots, our business, we've been offering courses on these topics that occur out in the woods, where this talk should be taking place, maybe next time. And at Wildeor, our foundation, we're establishing partnerships with organizations here in the Netherlands to experiment with different ways to rewild humans. I'd love to take this beyond the capacity of what we're able to deliver at the moment with a small team, to find places that really offer opportunities to connect with the natural world in many different ways, to develop training networks that can help people from all walks of life find wildness in their own communities, professions, or personal life. And I'd love to explore these topics more from an investment perspective, what focusing on nature connection could do to shape the green economy. And I'd love to hear what connections this presentation might have sparked for you, or what opportunities you could see within your own networks. So on that note, I'm going to say a final thank you to Deborah and to Genevieve, and thank you to all of you for listening. And hopefully after this, before you jump onto your next activity, you're able to stop for just a moment and reach out and connect with something natural, whatever you decide that to be.
Thank you very much, Gina, for those wonderful insights and taking us through your adventure and your journey. We we have time for questions now. So you can either use the chat box on the side, or you can unmute yourself and pose them directly to Gina. I have one, Gina, before I hand over to our audience. You mentioned that your perspective completely changed, or has changed a lot from your experience when you were outdoors for a whole year. What would you say, what was it that really changed? What was that shift that then happened when you realized that you actually have now a different perspective of nature?
Yeah, I think the biggest shift for me was noticing how easy it was to connect, and but equally how easy it was to disconnect. So because we had these, these rules, that we had to be outside, and my husband was cataloging the amount of time we were spending. And, if we weren't spending enough, if we weren't going to hit our target, then it was, we've got to, right, okay, we're going to have dinner outside, breakfast is outside, in between lectures, you've got to maybe take a notebook and work outside. And that just those enforced rules took us to outdoor spaces. And it was actually, what we were really looking for was to connect with nature. But actually what we realized is these gray areas were really the opportunities to do something. And it's very easy for those activities to get lost. It's very easy to say, oh, okay, I'll do it. On Sunday, I'll go for a walk with the family. Or next week, we'll go on holiday and we'll spend time outside. But actually finding those little moments every day can have really rewarding benefits, and we saw it particularly in our health. We slept the best we have slept that year. We do continue now to sleep outside when we can. We have 2 small children, so it's not a blueprint for how to live, but I think just taking it to that extreme kind of caused this ripple effect for us of how we can now do things on on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Elisa, I think you were raising your hand. Or I saw another hand raising. So please feel free to unmute yourself. Aude, please go ahead.
No, Elisa, go ahead, since you were first.
First, just to let you know, the chat is disabled, so we can't add messages. The question I had, so I work more in, I guess I'm more on the corporate side and strategy and investments. So I'm really interested in like any work that you've done with leadership teams or management teams on how to bring that connection in so that nature then forms part of the strategy. And how do you get that sort of connection so that like as nature isn't separate to the corporate strategy or the business strategy, but something that is lived and felt?
Yeah, so I'm actually so I've joined a group this year. It's called the Bioleadership Fellowship. So I'm actually now just starting to explore this because it's not, I'm going to say straight off, it's not an area that I'm familiar with, but I really recognize the need for it. And that's actually come from private courses that we've delivered where people are asking increasingly for it. So it's something that I'm exploring now, and I can, there are some very interesting examples of businesses that have, are shifting their strategies to include nature, not as a stakeholder, but more as a partner within their thinking. And that goes right through from organizing, how the teams operate. So looking at how the teams themselves can engage with the natural world, and giving it relevance to the work that they're doing, up to looking at supply chains, resource use, energy use. So it kind of, what I can see is when this comes in, the same as we experience with everyday life, when you start to put nature as a foundational partner within your organization, then I think you start to consider it in a different way, and you look at impact in a different way.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you so much, Gina and Deborah, for organizing. I really enjoyed your talk, and especially this idea that there needs not be a dichotomy, that this is something that's constructed and a sort of a conceptual legacy from the 19th century, and that we can move beyond this. And I love the expression of rewilding humans, and this particularly interesting and resonates with me because I'm involved with a chemical company that, of course, has an industrial footprint, and I think this dichotomy is really not helpful when you are trying to understand, what it means to work for biodiversity when you have an industrial footprint in nature. So I would love to to learn more about how you've been developing these concepts, and particularly thinking about the industrial footprint, as one wants to become a good corporate and citizen of nature as an industrial company in the 21st century, how to think about it, and in a way that isn't antagonistic. I think a lot of industrial companies are looking for a way forward like this.
That's really lovely to hear. And I'm more than happy to, I had my email address on the slides, but I'm more than happy to come together and have a chat and brainstorm more to get a discussion started. But I think this is obviously, it's lovely to hear what was sparked during the presentation. And I would be really intrigued to hear how you can see these concepts working within the framing of the industry that you're working with, because that's, for me, I find that's where I find the excitement. The frameworks that we've created are they are frameworks, and there is room for flexibility and movement within them, and it's just about finding those points where you can introduce that flexibility.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Any more questions from the audience? The chat field should now work. So in case you can't speak and want to post a question, you can put it in there, and I can ask Gina the question for you. Karen, please go ahead.
Hi, and thank you, Gina. It was a wonderful information that you gave us. I didn't understand everything because my English is not that perfect, but I appreciate very much the access that you have to nature. And you said nature begins to be a partner of many companies now. And do you think that we will achieve one day the step that we realize a partner is also something outside of us, that we are in nature, that we are nature, that we are one with nature, and that there is no more disconnection at all? Because when I realized that I'm just part of it, I start to take care more and more of everything.
Yeah, it's I think it's a really good question, and it's one that I struggle with myself, because also when I give presentations like this, I'm conscious that I'm always, I'm talking about nature and culture, or myself and nature. So that, even with the terminology that we have now, there is that separation. The thing I would say is that when we are looking at our own interaction and our own experiences, we we are the leader of our own story. We can only ever see it from our perspective. So in that sense, there's always going to be an element of separation. And I think for me, it's about recognizing the elements of the story and the characters that are there. So I think the characters that we have at the moment are very narrow. And actually we can be a lot more inclusive. And if you take an ecocentric approach, and if you start to look at yourself as an element within the natural world, it can be really liberating and rewarding, starting to see and interact with natural elements not as species, not as beings, but as individuals themselves. That's maybe getting a little bit into the sort of the esoteric, but it's I think to answer your question, I think we're a very long way off. But I think what we can do is try to drive the story of our environmental future in a slightly different direction.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Oliver, I see your hand raising. Please go ahead.
Oh, hello everybody. Do you see me? Yes, it seems that you are seeing me. Thanks a lot for this absolutely amazing and inspiring contribution about nature and human being. I work in this topic, especially with companies, and I also had a lot of experience with how can I say, private, no, not private, protected areas. And what I felt and what I still feel is that nature often face barrier that we have between genders or between minority and majority, or division in our culture. And so Maggie, how do you see the capacity of this rewilding concept or dynamic or movement, momentum, to go beyond this very hierarchical way of processing that we have now in nature, that for me often is just a matter of the relations between most frequently the men and women, but also between the elite and I would say middle or working class and so on.
Yeah, that's lovely question. Lots to unpick. The first thing I would say is that nature is, and again I'm using this as in a separate form, but nature is an incredible equalizer. So what we see especially when we take students outside and we engage with these topics of sustainability, of conservation, of inclusivity, of climate resilience, and we do that outdoors, there is immediately a removal of the hierarchical system. You know, you're not in the physical university setting that maybe perpetuates that. We also see it with engaging with physical activities. So in our courses, we always take a head, heart, and hands approach. And actually, for a lot of people, they're engaging with activities that are new and novel for them. So again, you remove the intellectual hierarchy, because you have people at different stages when they're engaging with these courses. Some people have done it before, some people haven't. And I find it incredibly rewarding to see how people react to that. So we've taken a lot of bushcraft activities. So bushcraft is this concept of engaging with the natural world using a skill set. So learning how to make fire, how to make shelters, these kind of things. We've taken a lot of those activities and twisted them to look at them from an inclusivity perspective. So to give a nice real world example, when you're learning to make a fire bow, which is a bow made of wood and thread that you use to create friction to create fire. It's typically seen as the pinnacle of survivalism. If you can do this, you are outdoorsy. You can be on your own in the elements. And actually, if you look to indigenous cultures, typically people will use a fire bow in pairs because it's an incredibly physical activity. It requires a huge amount of energy. And somehow we've kind of turned it into this, you have to do it alone. You have to be on your own. So we will always give these courses, and we will always ask people to first work together and to create fire together. So they're all starting from the same point. And it immediately shifts the focus onto teamwork. It shifts it onto creating something together. It doesn't matter if you don't get fire, you've gone on this journey together. And it also removes that disappointment at the end if people can't do it. So these, just by taking all of these elements into an outdoor setting, it really does break down that hierarchical structure very naturally. And we also see that in forest schools concepts. I don't know if you're familiar with that at all, with children in schools, that actually, when kids have all this pent-up energy and they're kind of kept in a classroom, they can focus more when they're outside. They can be physically active, which allows them to engage their brain as well. So yeah, at a very, very basic level, taking it outside is the easiest option for me.
How would you say, Jen and Gina, that how the confidence is connected with that, with rewilding human beings? Because I think what people often experience is that they don't have the knowledge, or they think they always need a huge amount of clothing, functionality things. They need to take things into nature to interact with nature. And I wonder how confidence comes into play. As you say, if you know how to make fire, if you had the experience you had when you were in nature. I think people also, they're very disconnected from nature, not just because their daily the routines are just not, we just don't need it anymore. We are all indoor, and it's all works without going out, right? You don't have to go and find food in the morning. You can all do, you have electricity. So I wonder, how much confidence comes into place, because I think people are also, when they go into the nature, they don't maybe feel that confident anymore being out there, because they just don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. And we see that a lot as well. If we take groups into the woods, if they don't have activities straight away, then there's kind of this moment of, well, what do we do now that we're here? There is a very beautiful quote from a Canadian called Mors Kahansky. And he's the person who kind of put a lot of these what we call nature skill, put these ideas down on paper. And Mors says, the more you know, the less you carry. And that's really the element that we take, or the approach that we take. It is about building confidence, and it's exactly that kind of started me on this journey. I mentioned it in the presentation. when I was engaging with outdoor courses, you know, this idea of I'm, you know, my partner's not outdoorsy, or my, you know, my kids aren't interested in the outdoors. It comes from a lack of confidence and not knowing what to do. Again, it's all about framing. You know, there are different levels in terms of nature connection. I'm not advocating that everybody needs to, you know, make their own fires and live outside. It's more about giving it that place in everyday life. So looking at the activities that you enjoy, what are the ones that you could take into an outdoor environment? What are the ones that could maybe be adjusted so that you have that kind of more frequent connection? For a lot of people, that's sport. You know, running is a great one, but I would also challenge you to, you know, with running, what I see is a lot of people tend to zone out as well. You know, they put their headphones on, they've got their music or their podcast, and they're in their head. And what is really nice is when you get true nature connection, you can get out of your head. So just finding those ways to remove that continuous stimulation, and let your own body physically and mentally connect with something beyond yourself.
Thank you, Gina. Lisa, I see your hand raising. Please go ahead.
Thanks again. I guess the question was around, how do we help, I'm more on the corporate side, but how do we help consumers to make actually nature-based choices? So it's, you know, it's one thing to go out into nature and enjoy nature, but then, you know, there's the whole plethora of making decisions around what to buy. I mean, there's just so much information. It's very hard to make, even if you want to and have the motivation to be really nature positive in your endeavors. How do we navigate that, and how do we help brands to become educators?
It's a minefield. You know, I struggle with it myself. We kind of try to limit our purchases as much as possible, and we try to make ethical, environmental, ecological choices when we do, but it is an absolute minefield. One of the things that I'm very interested in at the moment, and this is very much from a consumer perspective, is the confusion between need and want. So this is something we're starting to explore at the moment. What do you actually need to live, and what are the things that you want to live with? Because I think those two things get very confused sometimes. And what I see is that a lot of the time is this wanting certain products is actually to fill to fulfill desires that can maybe be met through experiences or through lots of other different ways. It's, you know, it's a short-term buzz, and actually our needs in terms of a health perspective, an education perspective, a social cohesion perspective are not necessarily being met. So we're kind of trying to fill it with our wants and not actually meeting our needs. So it's really difficult. But from a corporate perspective, so one of the things that we did recently with a design company is, you know, they wanted to shift to a more sustainable way of working, and you know, they were starting to think about the resources that they used and what they could offer to clients in terms of what materials they could use. And we took them out into the woods, and we connected with trees. Now this design company, you know, they've got a whole carpentry sector. You know, a lot of them are working with wood, but they're working with planks of wood, and they hadn't actually, you know, there wasn't the connection between the planks of wood that they were using to make the products or to realize their clients' ideas, and the trees that the wood was coming from. So actually just bridging that, closing that circle of, okay, this is where the resources come from. This is what is needed to create a product. Unfortunately, because of the way we work now, increasingly people only see a small part of the process, and that makes it incredibly difficult for them to understand the impacts of a huge supply chain. But that helped them to really say, okay, let's look at the longevity of our products. It's ridiculous if we, a client is asking for wood that is from trees that take 50, 100 years to reach maturity, if we can do it with a different product. So it was all about bridging that gap in terms of connection.
So I guess my question though is the next step. When you say a tree that is 150 years versus another option, right? Even now, you're like, how do you pick between the options? And you frame it as things that are, I guess, luxuries that people might not need, right? But what about the things they do need, like going to the store and buying an apple? There are 5 different options. How does a consumer pick the nature positive one, the best one? They're all there. These are not luxuries. This is food. How does one navigate that as a consumer, and how does a brand educate people to say this is the best choice?
Yeah, I honestly don't know if I have an answer, because it's really in the best way possible. If we're talking about consumer purchasing, then we're also talking about a huge number of social factors. We're talking about cost, we're talking about time. It's really difficult, and this is where this is where we need to come at both ends of the consumer cycle. What is offered to consumers needs to be constructed in an environmentally positive way. We should really be looking at the consumer cycle in a circulaic way, or in a circular model. And consumers, I don't know whether we need to educate consumers, or whether, what we're essentially getting to is a complete societal shift, and that is huge. It's something that needs to happen. There is just, we cannot build a financial model that is solely focused on growth. It is impossible. From an ecological perspective, every system that grows collapses eventually. So I think that, for me, it's really about looking to the corporate sector and talking to those that are producing and supplying the food. I've worked in the past with looking at projects with supermarkets, and again, there's a huge amount of disconnect between the products that they're selling and where they're coming from, and not looking at that consumption cycle in a circulaic way, but just this idea that, okay, when it's gone, and then and that's it. I'm sorry, I'm giving a terrible answer to your question, but it's an incredibly difficult one to unpack. But I think to summarize, I don't think the fault lies with the consumer. I think it lies on the models that we are continuing to popularize in terms of consumerism. And I think those are starting to change, but they need to change much quicker.
Yeah, I mean, my 2 cents is that while the fault doesn't lie with the consumer, the power does. And if you can make choice and decision easy, which is currently not, then you have a powerful lever to make change. So the fact that you don't know the answer is the problem, right? Like, if there's no easy way, if once you become conscious of nature, you cannot make nature conscious decisions, then that's disconnect. Doesn't matter what corporates think or what everybody's doing. If you can't make the choice yourself, even when you go to the store to buy an apple, then that's the challenge. I think that's a really interesting one here to solve. Sorry.
Thank you.
We're at the hour. And as you were both speaking, I was just thinking, if, when you say that disconnect that Elisa was mentioning, and I really wonder if someone is more and more connected to nature, or feels more and more connected and has that confidence to be in nature, I wonder if, that wouldn't just happen automatically, that every choice you would do, that you would not be disconnected from nature, but always have in mind what it does to nature. And I can imagine if every single of us would be more in nature, or would be more connected to nature, we would do very different choices today. And with that, maybe one final advice from your side, Gina, but if we all go out there and take it as a challenge to take those wives or husbands or kids that are not in outdoor, don't like to be outdoor, how can we make outdoor attractive to them without, having that, let's go outdoor, it's raining, or maybe we choose a different day, let's choose the perfect day. So it's already, just going outdoor is already, we think we need a concept. So what would be your advice to us, how we can make our families, friends, more, to be more outdoor and make it attractive to them?
Tread lightly. This, when you start to connect with these ideas, they can be overwhelming, and I can see exactly where your thought process is going, Deborah. I have it with my own kids. I'm like, what are we going to do today? Where are we going to go? If I take them there, what do I need to take with me? Some things that can dissipate very quickly when you step outside. That is the simplest thing you can do. Also, if we are talking specifically about children, give it a little bit of time. Sometimes I head outside with my kids and the first 10 minutes are a nightmare. There are tears, there are, I don't want to do this, I want to do something else. You kind of question what you're doing. 15 minutes is usually what it takes. And they find something, they go off, they start to engage. What stimulates you will stimulate them. They'll be fascinated by what you're interested in. So, let your own curiosity open up, and they'll follow.
Thank you very much for these closing words, very inspiring, and thank you very much for this inspiring start into the morning. I think we will all go out of this session with a call to action, or with something that we can do. So thank you very much. Thank you to the audience for joining us today at this wonderful session. Oliver, I see your hand is raising. Is it because you want to say something before I close, or is it the same hand as it was there before? No? Okay, good. Great. Thank you, everybody. I wish you a wonderful day. I see it's the same hand. I wish you a wonderful day, and I look forward to seeing you at another Impact for Breakfast session. And I'll be sharing this recording and Gina's contact details. So in case you want to follow up with her, or if you know anyone in your network that should connect with Gina, please do connect them, so we can bring more people into nature. Thank you very much, Gina. Take care, everybody.
Thank you very much for having me.
Bye.
That was great.
Thank you very much. was wonderful. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.